we've got to talk about what's really going on with the Karmelo Anthony murder case. It's blowing up online and has ignited a new culture war firestorm. Dive deeper into the Belfast attack that sparked a dangerous riot. Make sense of the Bricks and Minifigs reckless Ben GoFundMe twist that no one expected in that LEGO scandal. And break down what last night's primaries exposed about Platner, Maine, and Nevada. We're talking about all of that and even more on today's brand new DeFranco show. You daily dive into the news, so buckle up, hit that like button, and let's just jump into it, starting with this. Karmelo Anthony has been found guilty of murder for the fatal stabbing of Austin Metcalf and sentenced to 35 years in prison. And despite lawyers on actually both sides saying that race had nothing to do with what happened, the case continues to be thrust into the national spotlight by those who argue that this and a handful of other cases show that the Western world is facing an epidemic of violence against white people. And so let's start with what happened, right? This goes back to April of 2025 when both Anthony and Metcalf were 17 years old. And what's generally agreed on is this. Their high school track teams were taking part in a district-wide meet in Frisco, Texas. It started raining and Anthony ended up in a tent belonging to Metcalf's school. Metcalf then arrived at the tent along with his teammates, including his twin brother, and told Anthony to leave. It's a confrontation followed that ended with Anthony pulling a pocket knife out of his bag, stabbing Metcalf in the chest, who was then pronounced dead shortly after arriving at a local hospital. But then beyond that, the details have been disputed in court. The defense said that Anthony had actually been invited to the tent, but that when Metcalf and his brother arrived, both of whom were much larger than Anthony, they told him to leave, saying Metcalf pushed Anthony while his brother stood nearby, for all Anthony knew, ready to jump in. With the defense telling jurors that Metcalf had, quote, no legal right to put his hands on Karmelo and that Anthony had to make a split-second decision about whether his life was in danger, and ultimately arguing that prosecutors failed to prove Anthony did anything but defend himself. Or with them also arguing that the stabbing had been carried out under what's known as sudden passion, telling the jury decisions made in the heat of the moment are different than decisions that come after reflection. They called a few witnesses to the stand, including students and Anthony's former coach, who spoke to Anthony's character and academic success. But then you also had the prosecution calling nearly 24 witnesses, including several eyewitnesses, and several of them rejected the idea that this was self-defense, with some acknowledging that Metcalf pushed Anthony to get him to move after asking him several times to leave, but not in a way that justified deadly force. You also had some witnesses saying that Anthony already had his hand in his backpack when Metcalf approached him, and saying that Anthony threatened Metcalf, with one testifying that Anthony had told Metcalf, touch me and find out. And ultimately, the prosecution pretty much summing up their argument in one statement, saying, you don't get to meet a shove with a stab, especially if you provoke the shove. And so then with all that, you had the judge also allowing the jury to consider manslaughter charges, or which would carry to a sentence of up to 20 years in prison, but it took them less than 3 hours to agree on the first-degree murder conviction. A conviction that could have actually carried a maximum sentence of 99 years, but they decided on 35. And while he was otherwise tried as an adult, the death penalty hadn't been considered since Anthony was a minor at the time of Metcalf's death. But also the fact that it's only prison time, it's something that many on the right have taken issue with people like Congressman Randy Fine, MAGA influencer Matt Walsh, alleged human trafficker Tristan Tate, and far-right commentator Nick Fuentes, all among those having called for Anthony's life to be ended. With Tate saying that it should be done by firing squad and televised live, while Fuentes, he's backed the idea of a public execution, and also you have people pointing out how he once said on his show,
this young man who killed a beautiful young white person who was productive and was going to contribute to society, he should be made an example of by the law. You have this persistent problem of brutality from blacks, brutal, merciless, senseless violence from adolescent black men. I think there has to be something done about it. We should deliver the death penalty in equal measure to the killer. And in order to send that message, we have to do it in public.
And while Fuentes, he gets a ton of views saying stuff like this, he is by no means the only one that's been emphasizing that this was a case of a black person killing a white person. For just a couple of weeks after Metcalf's death, you had Jake Lang, a pardoned January 6th rioter and the leader of a group called Protect White America. He organized a small demonstration at the stadium, which of course then drew counter-protesters, with actually Metcalf's father being among those denouncing the protest. And then connected to all that, Anthony's family, they've been harassed, doxxed, and swatted, as well as falsely accused of spending hundreds of thousands of dollars raised for legal fees on a new house and a car. And you have people like far-right influencer Benny Johnson actually arguing that Anthony's parents, they should go to prison too. And then also the judge who lowered Anthony's bond to $250,000, allowing him to go free while awaiting trial, he was also the target of attacks. And then last week, right, Jake Lang, he was back outside of the courthouse shouting that Anthony should be lynched. And then also on the flip side, you had supporters of Anthony gathering and sometimes clashing with the other group, some shouting free Karmelo. Though also with this, I should note that there are those on the left who aren't so much in the free Karmelo camp, right? It hasn't been a pure left versus right situation. Also, one of the major criticisms that we've seen is that none of the jurors in this case were black. Though that said, you have a number of experts saying there's no sign that was deliberate and the jury was otherwise fairly diverse. But then still, you have plenty saying that is an issue, reporting to research that's shown that public perceptions of violence can change depending on the race of the victim and offender. And actually, historically, in the US, whether or not race is a factor in an alleged crime, many say that it's often been a factor in the outcome of a trial, especially if the suspect is black and the victim's white. And so you've seen some arguing that the trial and the outcome may have looked very different if the roles were reversed. And to make their point, some have pointed to comparisons of other high-profile cases where race became a flashpoint. Right? Many pointing to the situation with George Zimmerman, for example, acquitted of second-degree murder and manslaughter after shooting and killing 17-year-old Trayvon Martin, arguing self-defense. But then also with this, you have some folks on the right bringing up an example that they say proves their point about this being part of a wider issue about anti-white violence. Or with former Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, comparing the Metcalf case to that of Irina Zarutska. She's a 23-year-old Ukrainian refugee who was fatally stabbed in North Carolina last August. And in that instance, the man that killed her, he was found incompetent to stand trial for now, which Greene basically argued is letting him off easy. And then, going back to Fuentes, you had him bringing up that fatal stabbing of Henry Novak in the UK that we've been talking about, writing on Twitter. He was clearly motivated by nothing other than pure racial hatred for white men, just like the Sikh killer in the UK, saying the courts need to make an example out of these pieces of shit to send a message that this evil won't be tolerated. And also the outrage around Novak's killing has contributed to the growing anger around another terrible murder in Belfast, where we talked about that on yesterday's show, but since then, the rage has ballooned into protests and massive riots where you've had masked men setting cars and homes on fire as families fled for safety. And this after earlier this week, you had a man brutally stabbed on the street who's currently in serious condition with injuries to his face, neck, and back, and even lost an eye. Video of that attack, it's gone viral online with people everywhere condemning this horrific violence. And the suspect, he's been arrested and charged with attempted murder, but also there's been a ton of focus on the fact that he came to Northern Ireland from Sudan. And with that, you've had tons of far-right voices in the UK and really all over the world using this tragedy to stir up anti-immigration rhetoric and racism. And because tensions around these subjects are already heightened over there, you've had tons of leaders trying to urge people to remain calm and protest peacefully, knowing just how easy it is for things to get out of hand. But instead, you've had many turning up the heat with, for example, the UK's far-right Restore Party writing things like, "Do not make peace with evil, destroy it," and saying with the British people's approval, a Restore Britain government will put murderous third world savages to death. You also had anti-immigrant activist Tommy Robinson accusing Prime Minister Keir Starmer of welcoming terrorists into our country and said that the government has blood on their hands for granting the suspect asylum, with them also sharing information on the protests happening there. And then you also have people like Elon Musk sharing that information to even more people. Or with Musk bouncing between retweeting a bunch of inflammatory posts about the crime and also telling people that only by protesting repeatedly and loudly will there be any change. And the protests in Belfast quickly turned chaotic. Again, homes getting set on fire as rioters, many of them masked, targeted buildings that they believed immigrants lived in. You had vehicles set on fire as well, and some transport services in and around the city had to be shut down. And it's left the community frightened and shaken, with one BBC reporter explaining,
"We've seen police officers and firefighters having to actually rescue families from those buildings, bringing them out through the flames. So there has been disruption on the streets of Belfast this evening. There has been damage to some property, and in some places there is a serious risk to life. This is exactly what the authorities were worried about. It's what they'd warned of."
And when it comes to the damage, you have footage from this morning showing the aftermath, showing cars completely destroyed and turned to ashes, homes scorched with windows shattered. And so far, you've had the police service in Northern Ireland posting that at least 2 arrests were made in relation to all this. You've got officials condemning the violence as an act of self-harm to communities impacted and adding, "This disorder is an insult to the victim of this assault, an insult to the members of the public who bravely stepped forward to save his life, and the officers who rushed to the scene." You've also had the family of the stabbing victim speaking out against the riots, saying, "This has been a massive shock to our whole family, and right now our only priority is being at his bedside and helping him recover." But they also said that the unrest wasn't welcome and, quote, "We have many migrants who make a deeply valuable contribution to our country, including in our healthcare system and hospitality sector, and we depend on them to make our country work," saying we do not want this terrible tragedy to be used to divide people or fuel hostility. And so then with that, you've seen some specifically calling out social media companies for allowing incensed rhetoric on their platforms, arguing that it's contributed to the violence. With many there also calling out Elon Musk directly for not only owning a platform where this kind of rhetoric thrives, but adding to it himself. With one MP saying the government needs to, quote, "take action against tech billionaires like Musk who control divisive algorithms that incite hatred." And you also had Northern Ireland's Justice Minister saying,
"When you have people like Elon Musk actually retweeting protests without the context that we have in Northern Ireland, that so often street demonstrations will spill over into violence, and without knowing the temperature that we're dealing with here, it just goes to show that they're willing to exploit what was an absolutely tragic and horrific event in order to make a wider political point. I would hate to think my politics was so base that when someone almost loses their life, my first thought is, how do I exploit this for my political gain?"
Also, Prime Minister Keir Starmer has condemned the protests as unacceptable and adding, "It is clear that people were targeted last night because of their backgrounds and I will not tolerate it." And then you've had others being even more direct when calling out the racism behind this, with one MP who represents part of Northern Ireland saying,
"What you're seeing is a race-based pogrom. We're seeing men going door to door asking to get the foreigners out based exclusively on the colour of their skin. It's not based on what they're contributing to society, what their status here is.
With many also arguing that the racism behind the riots is also highlighted by the fact that there are other serious crime trends in Northern Ireland that do not result in this same attention, and in particular, violence against women. Some reports have claimed that Northern Ireland is actually the most dangerous place to be a woman in and around the UK, right, as it has one of the highest femicide rates in Europe. And while news of just terrible murders have made major headlines, they haven't led to this level of outrage, and you had many arguing that this just shows how people are cherry picking the crimes that serve their political agendas. But that said, I will note that the outrage does not appear to be going anywhere, even as you have these leaders trying to rein it in. Belfast's mayor has reportedly been facing serious death threats amid the chaos. You also have far-right MP Rupert Lowe naming the politicians that he says were responsible for the border when the stabbing suspect entered the country, writing a letter demanding that they explain how he was let in, and adding, "The public are rightly demanding answers." And as for where things stand right now, you have the police saying that they have an increased presence across the country in the coming days, and some events, they've even been canceled out of fear that more riots could be on the way. But for now, again, of course, I'd love to know everyone's thoughts here, but especially if you are in or around the UK or Northern Ireland, what are your thoughts here? Then there's more that we got to dive into in just a minute, but first, let me thank a sponsor and say, I'm just gonna say it. If you're not on Mint Mobile, there is a very real chance that you're getting ripped off right now. I mean, just check your phone bill. You know I'm right. Today's sponsor, Mint Mobile, is the move. They offer premium wireless plans starting at just $15 a month. And at a certain point, I had to ask myself why I was paying so much for my ignore calls and send memes device. And Mint, they use the nation's largest 5G network, giving access to 5G coverage that reaches 98% of Americans. And instead of forcing you into some bloated plan that you don't need, you pick exactly the amount of data that actually fits your life. 5 gigabytes, 15, 20 gigabytes are unlimited. And you can bring your own unlocked phone or get a new one through Mint, and your number comes with you. Switching is also shockingly painless. You can sign up and activate in minutes with eSIM from basically anywhere. And honestly, switching felt less like changing carriers and more like escaping a financially abusive relationship, which also probably explains why 96% of Mint users rate themselves highly satisfied with customer care. Plus, every plan comes with a 7-day money-back guarantee. So stop letting your wireless bill break your bank. If you like your money, Mint Mobile's for you. Shop plans at mintmobile.com/DeFranco or scan that QR code. Again, that's mintmobile.com/DeFranco. But then diving right back into the news, there were a bunch of super important primary elections yesterday that we need to talk about. We're starting off in Maine, where you have easily one of the single most talked about, closely watched, and consequential contests of the entire election cycle. Though right now, we kind of knew what was going to happen, right? Because you've got incumbent Republican Susan Collins running unopposed for a 6th term, but also the Democratic nominee, Graham Platner. He's been giving Dems hope for a little bit that they could actually finally flip the seat that they've been lusting for ever since Collins first won 30 years ago. And with them, there are a number of different factors at play. For one thing, Collins is now the only Senate Republican to represent a state that presidential nominee Kamala Harris won in 2024. And while Collins isn't exactly MAGA, you have many saying, she kind of allows him to run rampant. And that's as you have Trump's absolutely abysmal approval ratings possibly doing her in November. And that's as you've had many saying that she could be facing the strongest Democratic opponent she's had in 3 decades. With that being Graham Platner, who's a 41-year-old oyster farmer who is both a veteran of the Marines and the Army. He's run an incredibly successful campaign as a Bernie Sanders-styled populist with a strong anti-establishment pitch. He's had an enormous groundswell of support, and as of late May, he even raised more money than any other candidate for the seat, including Collins herself. And he was expected to win his primary easily after the only other major primary opponent, current Governor Janet Mills, suspended her campaign back in April. Her name was still on the ballot, and so heading into the polls yesterday, one of the biggest questions was, well, how big of a margin will Platner win by? Especially because despite all the support, Platner's campaign's also been plagued by numerous controversies. First, you had old Reddit posts surfacing where Platner had downplayed military sexual assault, used homophobic slurs, demeaned women, and made other controversial comments, all of which he apologized for. Then came out the pictures of a tattoo he had resembling a Nazi symbol, though he later had it covered up and claimed that he didn't know the connection. And then just in the last 2 weeks, you had things coming out that Platner had sent sexually explicit messages to multiple women while married, and 3 women who dated him came forward alleging that he had been volatile and physically intimidating in their relationships. And so then with that, you had more Democrats questioning Platner's ability to actually beat Collins in the general election. And it's another reason why you had political analysts just super closely watching the primary margins to see whether people would protest vote for Mills. And she did actually get a sizable chunk of the vote for someone who suspended their campaign, where with 90% of the votes in as a recording, she's currently hovering at just above 19%. And when you combine that with the other candidates in the race, it means that nearly a third of primary voters cast their ballots for other Democrats. And so you had places like the New York Times saying that margin, it suggested that some Mainers remained skeptical of him and left him with the challenge of persuading voters in the general election that Miss Collins' shortcomings were greater than his. And it looks like Platner's already trying to do that with him delivering a fiery victory speech last night where he seemed to acknowledge that he needs to work to repair credibility while also trying to shift focus to Collins and attacking her on the issues.
I've made mistakes in my life, mistakes that I regret, that I live with, and that I continue to learn from. And to any of those who feel let down or disappointed or disillusioned, it is my job to earn your trust, faith, and support. And I will spend every day of this campaign, and if I have the privilege, every day in the United States Senate, doing exactly that. Now, the national pundits, the political establishment, they keep looking for that one story, that one headline, that one moment in my life that they can define the campaign by. But in trying so hard to understand me, they failed to understand that this is not about me at all. This is a movement about us. If you believe, as I do, that we can change our politics and change our country, then you must also believe that people can change.
With Platner then also going on to slam Collins' record, blasting the moderate image that she's been cultivating and trying to tie her to Trump.
If you are an independent voice, why do you vote with Donald Trump 95% of the time? Susan Collins is only bipartisan when it doesn't matter.
And while Platner's chances of beating Collins, they're up in the air right now. One thing that we do know for sure is that this is going to be a messy, heated, and expensive race where Republicans are going to try to air his dirty laundry as much as possible. And in fact, they're already starting. Literally within hours of the polls closing yesterday, the National Republican Senatorial Committee released a digital ad calling Collins a senator we can be proud of, while painting Platner as a scandal-ridden candidate who's too out of touch. Then also, looking away from Maine, we saw the continuation of an important trend this cycle: victories by candidates backed by or aligned with Donald Trump. Right in the crowded Republican primary for South Carolina's governor, the candidate that Trump endorsed, current Lieutenant Governor Pamela Yvette, she led the pack with nearly all votes counted, though notably, she wasn't able to get the majority of the vote needed to avoid a runoff, and so that means that she's gonna have to face off against State Attorney General Alan Wilson in a few weeks. And that runoff, it's definitely not just guaranteed in the bag. As of recording, there's only a 3-point difference between Yvette and Wilson, and neither of those two got more than 30% as of recording. But in another indication of Trump's sway over the party, we saw Representative Nancy Mace not just losing, but getting destroyed in the gubernatorial race, where for the last few years, she has been increasingly MAGA and fought to align herself with Donald Trump after initially flipping her district by running as a moderate. But then, after aggressively pushing for the release of the Epstein files, she lost Trump's favor. And while she still tried to run for governor as a Trump-aligned candidate, it did not work. She is right now in almost dead last, in 5th place with just 12% of the vote. And then on the note of Republicans who strongly opposed Trump but then bent the knee and became staunch allies, we of course have to talk about Senator Lindsey Graham, because he also faced a closely watched and crowded primary that included at least one serious challenger and the possibility that he could be forced into a runoff. But thanks at least in part to Trump's backing, he was able to easily avoid a runoff, securing nearly 57% of the vote. Also in North Dakota, you had the incumbent representative for the state's sole House seat easily beating her primary opponent with help from Trump's backing. And then in Nevada, all 3 of the House candidates that Trump endorsed won their primaries. But again, as we look toward the general, it's going to be very important to see if those ties with Trump, they end up hurting some of those candidates. Right in Nevada specifically, Democrats currently hold 3 of the state's 4 House seats. And while they are favored to keep them, the 3rd district in particular is viewed as competitive. And keeping all 3 of those seats, it's absolutely imperative for Democrats if they want any hope at taking the House. But you've got Republicans hoping that a decent victory for incumbent Governor Joe Lombardo at the top of the ticket is going to help them flip that seat. Though as far as a victory from Lombardo, that is not at all secure. Right? Yes, well, he won his primary handedly without any real challenges. Nevada, it's a solidly purple state, and his endorsement from Trump, it could end up backfiring. I mean, even Fox News described him as the most at-risk GOP governor seeking another term this cycle. And after yesterday's primaries, Lombardo's now officially going to be facing a very strong opponent in November. That's Nevada's current Attorney General, Aaron Ford, who has won statewide elections for his current seat twice, proving that he has mass appeal in a key swing state. So overall yesterday, some things in some of the most important races of the cycle really solidified, but there also is a very long road to November, so anything can happen. And actually, another place that's constantly feeling like anything goes are the courts. Because a judge in Mississippi, they're pushing back against the AI takeover of the legal system by booting, fining, and even banning lawyers on both sides of this crazy case. A case that started with an attorney by the name of Tom Withers suing the city of Aberdeen for breach of contract regarding apparent unpaid legal fees. He had hired Kathleen Wilson and Chauncey Hunter Ridgway. Then the city contracted Mark McClinton and Catherine Williams, except the judge in the case, U.S. District Judge Sherry-Ann Aycock, they found something a little bit fishy in their legal citations submitted in court filings. She found citations to cases that never really happened. Because as it turns out, both sides had used AI to some measure to do their legal research for them, and shocker, that backfired because the system had hallucinations. And apparently, neither side did any sort of review or verification or anything before they submitted their briefs. Or with Robert Freund, a lawyer who investigates AI usage and misuse in the legal space, and the first one to bring attention to this case, calling it a comedy of AI errors and adding. In other words, there were 2 clients who basically were paying for ChatGPT or whatever LLM to argue against itself. And when the judge first called the attorneys out at a hearing in January, both sides admitted to not doing any sort of check and expressed regret and embarrassment. On one side, you had Catherine Williams fessing up to using an unnamed AI tool trained to produce results for her usual jurisdiction to do the research with a judge writing. She explained that this case is the only Mississippi case she has ever been involved in, yet she resorted to using the software apparently knowing that it was not designed to encompass Mississippi law. And then you had Kathleen Wilson saying she used a tool called First Drafts to write the entire briefing for her, with Wilson taking the stance that she didn't know that AI could make something up if it wasn't true, which the judge wasn't even buying for a second. Writing in essence, Wilson took the position that she was unaware that AI could produce hallucinated cases and explained that she did not even know what a hallucinated case was. The court finds that explanation to be insufficient and incredulous. And in fact, since that hearing where she apologized for using AI, she's been caught doing it again, or with other judges finding hallucinated cases in her filings as recently as April. Baycock writing, her continued AI misuse demonstrates an extreme dereliction of professional responsibility on her part. Though this court cannot consider subsequent conduct that did not occur before it and determination of the appropriate sanctions in this case, it finds that at minimum, Wilson's apologies to this court on January 20th, 2026 were not sincere. So as far as what ended up happening, you had Judge Aycock finding all four lawyers between $1,000 and $3,500, disqualifying them for participating in the future, outright canceling the trial and issuing a stay in the case, or their grounds being a violation of Rule 11 of the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure when they certified that the information in their filings was factual and correct. And on top of that, Wilson and Williams have actually been barred from appearing in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Mississippi for 2 years. And then the judge is also sending her order to the attorney disciplinary organizations in the states where all four lawyers are licensed. With Aycock writing, in an era of rampant unverified AI usage within the legal field, this case presents a prime example of the risk associated with serving as a rubber stamp when acting as local counsel. And she's right, the issue of AI in the legal field, I mean, it's garnered a lot of attention, and especially regarding this issue of AI hallucinations and legal citations. And so you have some experts saying that it's about time the judges and the court system, they stop coddling these attorneys caught red-handed like this. We're hearing that from people including Dr. Lance Elliott, who's an AI scientist and consultant who wrote an article for Forbes on this case specifically, saying the expectation is that lawyers are facing a learning curve and a bit more time is required before they'll be able to properly handle the use of AI. In my view, more than enough time has already passed. So one of the questions here is, do we see more judges like Aycock, who, by the way, like this isn't even her biggest punishment for AI misuse. Back in December, she reportedly slapped an attorney with a $20,000 fine and ordered her to take a continuing legal education course on AI hallucinations. Though you are also seeing more and more people calling for attorneys just to be disbarred. For now, we'll have to wait to see, do attorneys figure out a way to use these tools or stay away from these tools, or are we just gonna see an increase in attorneys using this and thus more punishments? And then there's even more that we gotta dive into in just a minute, but first, let me thank a sponsor, and it actually starts by saying, Iran, they announced the end of military operations against Israel while warning that future strikes in Lebanon could trigger even harsher retaliation. And stories like that, they're exactly why we use today's sponsor, Ground News. Because depending on where you read it, the framing gets very different, very fast, and it also helps us understand where people are coming from based off of the news they get. You have some outlets focusing on de-escalation, others focusing on the threat of wider war, and a few barely mentioning Lebanon at all. And Ground News lets you compare how over 260 outlets across the political spectrum are covering the same exact story side by side. So instead of getting trapped in one algorithm-fed perspective, you can actually see differences in framing, bias, and what details certain outlets emphasize or leave out. Ground News also shows you factuality ratings and source ownership data all in one place. One of my favorite interesting features is the blind spot feed, which flags stories covered mostly or entirely by one side, helping you quickly spot gaps in coverage. And you'd be surprised by, what you might be missing out on, which also explains a decent amount of, why people online feel like they're arguing from different realities half the time. So hey, if you care about understanding how stories are being framed instead of just reacting to headlines, subscribe today. Head to ground.news/DeFranco or scan that QR code to get 40% off unlimited access to their Vantage plan, the one I use. And then for the final block today, you've got some more news you need to know, starting with how yesterday afternoon, Reckless Ben's GoFundMe, which he made to help Brian Manziel in that ongoing fight for his dad's Legos against Bricks and Minifigs, it was taken down. And up to that point, it had raised over $450,000 that would have been used to cover the Manziel's legal fees and to recover the money that they lost through this whole situation. And with that, while we don't know exactly why that fundraiser went dark, you had some speculating that it was GoFundMe essentially siding with Bricks and Minifigs. Though you had others saying maybe it was a legal situation since Ben's facing a lawsuit and charges. But regardless, what you ended up seeing a lot of were people laying into both companies, saying things like, for GoFundMe to cave to pressure is disgusting and insanely cowardly. Tim Cottigan is their CEO and he should be made to answer for this. It's reprehensible. Why did this happen? Doesn't this mean that GoFundMe is essentially stealing from old people as well? And Bricks and Minifigs has officially nuked themselves for this one. Nobody on earth is gonna wanna buy from this absolute sleaze pit of a company after this, saying this is corporate suicide. You also had YouTuber Sean Fitzgerald even setting up a new donation fund on Give Send Go for Ben's defense fund. But then this morning, Ben's original GoFundMe was restored. And again, as of right now, we don't know why it went down or even why it came back up. GoFundMe hasn't said anything at this point. And so in the absence of that, you have many people online speculating it's because they were getting so much backlash. They're caving to public pressure, with some even giving Fitzgerald Gerald and Nod for starting that new fund on a platform that actually has a spine when it comes to controversial cases. And then, while all of that was playing out online, at the same time, you had the American Fork City Council getting basically consumed by this case last night. And for just about everyone who took the stand, the AFPD was their target.
This is unacceptable conduct of the police department. When Paul took office, he said, "I am extremely committed to ensuring our community members are proud of their police department and their officers. I am not proud of my police department officers. In fact, seeing this conduct, I am in fear of standing here with seeing if there's any retribution that they might bring on me, because that is what they did to this individual."
In 2024, I called the American Fork Police Department when I had a trespasser that was unwilling to leave. 2 officers and a lieutenant conducted the investigation, and when the trespasser was there, 1 officer called me an A-word.
The police department during this has demonstrated reckless usage of resources and responsibilities, and it has tainted faith in American Fork's ability to protect and serve.
But also I'll say not everyone has flack for the police there, because you also had a city councilman getting emotional as he thanked AFPD for helping his family stay safe in the blowback from the case.
I just want to make a comment and just thank our police. I know that's maybe a challenging thing. My family, ironically, had a scenario in in the last week where our family was targeted. And I just want to publicly thank those that responded.
So with all this, at least for right now, it's looking like things are going to stay under wraps for a while as the legal stuff plays out. But with that, I'll say it does seem like Ben's already feeling like he's getting the short end of the stick there.
I was not given a chance to share my side. The court just heard their perspective, not mine.
And so for now, the great Lego scandal continues. Right, and then last up today, we've got to talk about some major updates out of Iran because, I mean, we are barely holding on to this ceasefire if there really ever was a ceasefire. Because as soon as things seemed to cool off between Iran and Israel for a second, Iran let off a wave of attacks targeting U.S. assets in the Middle East last night. And it appears this whole situation started when a U.S. Apache helicopter was shot down near the Strait of Hormuz on Monday, with U.S. officials saying that the helicopter was likely hit by a drone off of the coast of Oman while it was patrolling the area. As far as the 2 American crew members who were on the helicopter, they were luckily able to escape and they waited in the water for 2 hours before being rescued, apparently by a U.S. drone boat in a sea operation that was the first of its kind for us. The Iranian officials saying the strike wasn't actually intentional, even though they've been firing drones at commercial vessels coordinating with the U.S. With Iran's foreign minister posting that foreign forces in proximity to our territory are at constant risk on account of their own human errors, plane accidents, or potentially being caught in crossfire. And at first, it seemed like Trump was actually going to let this slide. With the Wall Street Journal saying that Trump repeatedly said the incident, quote, wasn't a big deal in their phone call on Tuesday morning. Then he apparently changed his mind after a White House briefing with Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Dan Kane. Or because by yesterday afternoon, he posted the United States must, of necessity, respond to this attack. And from there, Central Command reported that it struck Iranian air defense, ground control stations, and surveillance radar sites near the Strait of Hormuz, claiming it was a proportional response to recent attacks on U.S. forces and international commercial ships transiting regional waters. With Iran firing back, launching attacks on U.S. targets in Bahrain, Jordan, and Kuwait, though officials say that all those attacks were intercepted. You then had foreign ministers of Arab states on the Persian Gulf making a joint statement to condemn these attacks, saying, persistence in this aggressive approach will only lead to further isolation. So now with all this, you have Iran saying that U.S. strikes at 2 vital water tanks. And well, as of recording, that has not been fully confirmed if it's true or not. If it is, I mean, it could leave 20,000 people without water in an area that's ranked as one of the hottest places on Earth, reaching temperatures of 122 degrees at times. So you have environmental experts saying in a region already facing extreme heat, chronic water scarcity, and a rapidly warming climate, the loss of drinking water infrastructure is more than physical damage, saying it threatens the health, resilience, and daily survival of entire communities. And right now, you have many saying that it's looking like things are heating back up with both sides getting more aggressive, and you've got the president still sounding off online saying their military is defeated and their economy is lost. It's over for Iran. So there, you've had many pointing to Trump saying similar things over the course of the last few weeks and months. So we'll continue to watch, report, and in the meantime, of course, whether it's this or anything we talked about today, I'd love to know your thoughts in those comments down below. But that, my friend, you beautiful bastard, is the end of your Wednesday Philip DeFranco Show dive into the news. Though I do have a treat for you just to click away. I also just uploaded my weekly episode of Crashing Out with myself and Alex Perlman. It is live. It is fantastic. If you haven't taken the dip yet, it's the exact opposite of this show. It's 90% opinion over there, and it ends up being the perfect 1-2 punch on a Wednesday. I got a link in the description for you, but hey, no matter what you do, let me just say thank you for watching, like, and subscribing. I love yo faces, and I'll see you right back here tomorrow.
They paid off SVU for the night because there were some predators out there.
Donald Trump made the Knicks lose.
They booed the out of that man.
It was, I think, mostly tears.
It is just Donald Trump denying reality publicly. The baby boy, MAGA whisperer, Hunter Biden.
Somebody was talking shit on him, and he was just like, I'm not one of the elite. I smoked crack at a Super 8, not Epstein's Island.
If they want to believe that it was stolen, they're gonna believe it.
To buy that much quartz is stupid.
It's Grand Theft Auto 6. The content will suffer. My relationships will suffer.